The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster of a machine. Nicknamed the Jug, it was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of World War II. With its massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, pumping out over 2,000 horsepower, the Thunderbolt could climb high, dive fast, and unleash devastating firepower with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. It quickly earned a reputation for being able to take incredible punishment. Pilots told stories of coming back with wings shredded, engines smoking, or fuselages riddled with flak, yet somehow managing to land. To many, the Jug was the armored bulldog of the skies. But the image of indestructibility came at a hidden cost. Behind every statistic of the Thunderbolt's toughness were men enduring some of the most dangerous missions of the war. The very qualities that made the plane famous, its size, its armor, its firepower, meant that its pilots were often sent into the worst situations. Where the more glamorous P-51 Mustang became the sleek escort fighter of legend, the P-47 was tasked with the brutal, grinding missions that chewed up airmen and spat them out. For the men strapped inside, survival was never guaranteed. They were ordered to dive into walls of flak, to strafe convoys, blast enemy armor, and tear up supply lines. They were the shield for bomber crews, flying escort into skies thick with Luftwaffe fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They were the hammer of ground support, called again and again to attack fortified positions where every weapon on the ground pointed upward. And while the Jug was tough, its pilots were not invincible. Many never came back from missions, cut down by flak, overwhelmed by fatigue, or lost over oceans and fields far from home. The statistics of durability overshadowed the human reality. Thunderbolt pilots suffered, bled, and died in staggering numbers. This is their story. The story of men who climbed into the cockpit of a beast, trusting its armor to carry them through the storm, knowing that every mission might be their last. Before Thunderbolt pilots could even think about facing the enemy, they had to conquer the Jug itself. And for many, this was the deadliest trial of all. Unlike other fighters of the era, there was no two-seat trainer version of the P-47. That meant every rookie had to take off, fly, and land the Jug alone on his very first attempt. Imagine climbing into one of the largest, heaviest fighters of the war, strapping into a roaring 2,000 horsepower engine, and knowing you had no instructor behind you, no second chance if you got it wrong. The Thunderbolt was not a forgiving machine. At over 14,000 pounds fully loaded, it was nearly twice as heavy as some enemy fighters. Its long nose made visibility on the ground difficult, and its sheer torque on takeoff could flip an inexperienced pilot before his wheels even left the runway. Many young men, barely out of flight school, were lost in training accidents before they ever crossed the Atlantic. Pilots described their first solo takeoffs as nerve-shattering ordeals, white-knuckled grips on the controls, sweat stinging their eyes as the Jug strained down the runway, threatening to veer off course at any moment. Landing was no easier. Its high stall speed and heavy frame punished the slightest mistake, snapping landing gear or sending the plane skidding into disaster. Survivors joked grimly that if you could take off and land a Jug twice, you were already a combat veteran. But beneath the humor lay a sobering reality. The Thunderbolt's steep learning curve claimed lives long before combat ever did. The crucible of mastering the Jug meant that only those who quickly adapted, those with a mix of nerve, instinct, and sheer luck, lived long enough to face the true dangers that awaited in enemy skies. When they did make it into combat, Thunderbolt pilots were thrown into one of the war's most critical roles, escorting Allied bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were sending massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators on daylight bombing raids against industrial centers and rail hubs. Their mission: cripple the Reich's ability to wage war. But the skies above Germany were death zones. The Thunderbolt, with its turbo-supercharged engine, was one of the few fighters that could climb high enough to fly alongside the bombers. Pilots flew tight formations above and around the lumbering B-17s, scanning the clouds for enemy aircraft. And the enemy came in swarms. Dozens of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove out of the sun, cannons blazing, tearing into bombers and escorts alike. The P-47 was rugged and powerful, capable of holding its own in a dogfight, but it carried one crushing flaw: its range. Even with drop tanks, Thunderbolts often had to turn back just as bomber formations reached their most dangerous targets. Pilots described the agony of breaking away, watching the vulnerable bombers disappear into hostile skies, knowing many would never return. Crews left behind sometimes cursed the fighters for abandoning them, though the pilots had no choice. Those who stayed in the fight endured running battles at high altitude, tracers stitching through formations, bombers exploding in midair. Pilots carried the guilt of watching entire crews perish, powerless to save them. Escort duty was supposed to be about protection, but for Thunderbolt pilots, it often became a mission of sacrifice, where they risked their lives and still felt they hadn't done enough. As the war shifted in 1944, the Jug found a new role: low-level ground attack. And for pilots, this was a whole new circle of hell. Instead of dueling fighters high in the sky, they now dove to treetop level, skimming fields and villages to blast tanks, trains, and enemy troops. The P-47's heavy frame and armor made it perfect for the job. It could carry bombs, rockets, and unleash torrents of .5 zero-caliber firepower. But every time a Thunderbolt roared down to strafe, it became the focus of every weapon on the ground. German infantry fired rifles and machine guns skyward. Flak cannons spewed black bursts into the sky. Even civilians sometimes shot at the Jugs. Pilots dove into walls of fire so dense that it seemed impossible to survive. They described missions were riddled with holes, yet still somehow flying. Others weren't so lucky. The danger wasn't just the enemy. At those speeds and altitudes, one mistake could be fatal. Pilots clipped treetops, slammed into power lines, or misjudged their pullout, and plowed into the ground. Strafing was one of the most lethal missions of the war, with casualty rates that rivaled bomber crews. And yet it was vital. Thunderbolt pilots crippled German supply lines, blasted tanks that threatened advancing infantry, and turned rail yards into smoking craters. But every mission was a gamble. Pilots called it riding the flak curtain, diving again and again into storms of fire, knowing that sooner or later luck would run out. While the Thunderbolt was most famous in Europe, it also carved a bloody reputation in the Pacific, and here the dangers were multiplied. Unlike the dense skies over Germany, the Pacific was a vast, unforgiving ocean. Pilots flew missions that stretched for hours across open water, staring at nothing but endless blue. Every man knew the same truth. If your engine failed, if you got lost, if you had to bail out, your chances of rescue were slim. Sharks, storms, or starvation claimed many before help ever arrived. The Jug's huge radial engine was built for punishment, but even it struggled in tropical heat. Oil ran hot, pistons strained, and humidity warped delicate components. Pilots sweated in cockpits that felt like ovens, their throats parched, nerves taut. And waiting for them at the end of those long flights were Japanese defenses, flak batteries hidden in jungles and swarms of nimble Zero fighters that could turn on a dime compared to the lumbering Thunderbolt. Dogfighting in the Pacific meant facing an enemy who lived and breathed aerial combat. Zeros attacked from all directions, slashing in with machine guns and cannons, vanishing into clouds or sunlight. P-47 pilots relied on their brute force, using diving speed, armor, and heavy guns to survive. Many won duels by sheer toughness, flying home with wings shredded or cylinders shot out. Others vanished in fireballs, their wreckage swallowed by the sea. Then there was the weather. Monsoons rolled in with no warning, walls of rain and thunder that could rip wings from the planes. Lightning danced across cockpits, instruments shorted, and visibility dropped to nothing. Pilots spoke of flying blind, praying they'd emerge from storm clouds still upright. In the Pacific, survival wasn't just about beating the enemy, it was about beating the ocean, the sky, and time itself. For Thunderbolt pilots, combat wasn't just dangerous, it was relentless. After the invasion of Normandy, Allied forces surged across France, and the Jugs became the spearhead of close air support. Every day, and often several times a day, squadrons were scrambled to attack German tanks, convoys, and railroads. Pilots rolled out of their bunks before dawn, strapped in, and launched into missions that demanded every ounce of stamina they had left. The Thunderbolt could carry bombs and rockets in addition to its 8.50 caliber guns, making it a flying arsenal. But this also meant pilots were constantly tasked with high-risk jobs. They dove into towns and forests, hunting panzer divisions and hammering troop positions under endless sheets of flak. The Germans learned to hide their movements, setting ambushes for low-flying fighters. Every mission was a test of nerve, every attack a brush with annihilation. Fatigue became a weapon all its own. Pilots lived in a state of exhaustion, flying 2 or 3 sorties a day, then returning to base to repair battered planes, rearm, and head back out. They fell asleep at mess tables, wrote hurried letters home between missions, and climbed into cockpits running on sheer adrenaline. The relentless schedule meant mistakes crept in, missed signals, botched approaches, fatal lapses of concentration. The losses mounted. Some squadrons lost half their strength in weeks. Pilots who survived one mission knew they'd be back in the air the next morning, flying the same deadly route. For many, it felt like the war was simply wearing them down, one sortie at a time. The Jug could endure punishment, but the men inside were human, and the constant grind left scars no armor could shield. Every time a Thunderbolt pilot climbed into his Jug, he knew the odds. Death was not an abstract fear, it was a constant presence, felt in the rattle of flak, the hiss of tracer rounds, and the sickening thud of shrapnel tearing into steel. Many described the surreal moment when a burst of flak exploded near their wing, the cockpit lit by a flash of orange, the smell of smoke filling their nostrils, and the realization that they had come within inches of being obliterated. Some survived only through blind luck. A bullet might shatter a canopy but miss the pilot's head by inches. A shell might detonate behind the engine rather than inside it. Others weren't as fortunate. Pilots watched their comrades vanish in puffs of smoke or streaks of fire, screaming last words over the radio before plunging into fields, forests, or seas. Each mission meant saying goodbye without knowing if you'd ever return. And yet, they flew anyway. Courage in the Thunderbolt wasn't the absence of fear. It was strapping in despite it. Pilots developed rituals, some kissing the ground before takeoff, others carrying tokens from home. When they landed, many stepped onto the airstrip, trembling, sweat-soaked, sometimes laughing with relief at simply being alive. The jug had carried them back, but always with the unspoken knowledge, tomorrow they'd face the storm again. For Thunderbolt pilots, death wasn't an occasional risk. It was a shadow in the cockpit, riding beside them on every mission. Survival was temporary, a reprieve bought with luck, skill, and the sacrifice of others. And that brutal reality wore on them as much as the enemy ever could. In the midst of constant danger, Thunderbolt pilots forged bonds as strong as steel. They lived together in tents and makeshift huts, shared rations, swapped stories, and laughed in the brief lulls between missions. Every man knew that the one sitting across from him at breakfast might not return by nightfall. That reality gave their friendships an intensity few outside combat could understand. The squadron became family. Pilots looked out for each other in the air, diving to cover a buddy under attack, or circling overhead as a damaged jug limped home. On the ground, they celebrated survival together, raising glasses to the ones who made it back. But they also mourned in silence when a cot lay empty, a locker unopened, a familiar voice never heard again. Loss was unavoidable. Many pilots spoke of the horror of watching their closest friends burst into flames mid-dive or vanish into the forest below, leaving only smoke and wreckage. Some described hearing a comrade's last radio call, short, panicked words that echoed in their minds for decades. For survivors, those moments left scars deeper than any wound, and yet even in grief, the bond drove them forward. Pilots flew harder to honor fallen friends, determined to finish the mission and carry on the fight. Brotherhood was both a comfort and a burden, the strength to endure, but also the constant pain of losing those who had become like brothers. For the men of the Thunderbolt, camaraderie was a lifeline, and loss was a shadow they carried long after the war. The P-47 was a marvel of engineering. Heavy armor, a massive radial engine, and 8.50 caliber machine guns. It could dive like a missile, rip apart armored convoys, and absorb damage that would shred lighter planes. Pilots trusted it to bring them home when no other aircraft could. But that very toughness sometimes bred overconfidence, pushing pilots into missions that even the jug couldn't survive. Strafing was the deadliest role. Flying low against tanks and trains meant every soldier with a rifle could fire on you. Pilots often came back with wings like sieves, canopies shattered, or fuel tanks leaking. Some never came back at all. Even the most skilled aces fell victim to a lucky burst of flak or a split-second mistake in a high-speed dive. The jug could take punishment, but it couldn't make its pilots invincible. The aircraft also had limitations. Its enormous weight meant it was less agile in dogfights compared to lighter German or Japanese fighters. Pilots had to rely on speed and diving power, but in close turns, they were vulnerable. And while the Thunderbolt's firepower was unmatched, its bulk made it a tempting target during low-level attacks. Many men died not because the jug failed them, but because their missions demanded the impossible. Every victory came at a cost. The wreckage of Thunderbolts littered fields from Normandy to the Philippines, silent monuments to men who had flown too low, stayed too long, or simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The jug was legendary, but legends are built on sacrifice, and its reputation was written in the blood of the men who flew it. When the war ended, the survivors of the Thunderbolt squadrons carried more than medals. They carried the weight of memory, the faces of friends lost, the screams over radios, the smell of burning fuel in their nostrils. Many tried to bury those memories, returning home to quiet towns and families, but the war never fully left them. Some lived with nightmares, sudden panic, or the silence of never speaking about what they endured. History often celebrates the Mustang as the glamorous fighter of World War II, the sleek escort that won the skies. But it was the Thunderbolt that bore the grind, the relentless missions, the close air support, the dangerous strafing runs where survival was never guaranteed. Jug pilots didn't fight for glory. They fought to break enemy lines, to shield bombers, to bring victory closer day by day. By war's end, thousands of Thunderbolts had been destroyed in combat, and countless pilots had been killed or maimed. Yet the men who survived never forgot what the Jug gave them: a fighting chance when the odds were stacked against them. Its roar over Europe and the Pacific became the sound of determination, resilience, and sacrifice. The legacy of the Thunderbolt is twofold: a machine that embodied American power, and the pilots who endured its darkest missions. They carried the heaviest burden, flying through fire, fear, and fatigue. Their story is not just about a plane, but about the price of victory, paid in sweat, blood, and unbreakable courage. Unbreakable courage. Unbreakable